is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Today we're talking about crime and mystery novels from Japan. We're going to start out with the development of the crime and mystery genre in the English-speaking world. We'll move on to Japanese crime and mystery writing, how it was inspired by Anglo-American crime and mystery writing, and how it evolved in its own way. And we'll end with the life and work of writer Seishi Yokomizo, especially his novel The Honjin Murders, translated into English by Louise Heal Kawai. I'm normally skeptical that spoilers actually ruin books. I know I'm not always careful about spoilers, although I generally do try to warn you when I'm going to spoil something. But even I recognize that you can't enjoy a good mystery if you already know the solution. So today I'm going to be really careful about spoilers in general and especially about the Honjin Murders. A quick content warning, this episode does include a discussion of murder. Obviously, we are talking about crime novels. I will not be going into any detail today. And there will also be a brief mention of a fictional character's narcotics addiction. It's been a while since Read Japanese Literature has done a genre episode. Actually, I don't think I've talked about genre very much since Season 2 episodes about magical realism and science fiction. So I'll volunteer once again that genre studies is both endlessly fascinating and painfully tedious. Genre is a broad term for a category of art, in this case, a work of fiction. Genre theory is the study of how we categorize stories, comedy, tragedy, romance. Genre is important because we can learn useful things about comparing stories that share common traits. But when we sit down to define what a genre really is, that's when things get complicated. For example, critics have been arguing about what makes a comedy for more than 2 millennia. And comedy is one of the few genres most people agree exists. The more Japanese literature I read, and the more secondary sources I read by scholars who approach genre from both an Anglo-American perspective and a Japanese perspective, the more I realize just how imperfectly genre translates. That is, of course, part of what we're talking about today. All of this is to say, I hope you'll keep in mind that genre is always a little fuzzy. It's useful to talk about, but the discussion is always going to be imperfect. Allow me to also start with a quick note about vocabulary. I've used the phrase crime and mystery writing in the episode title today. That's because I'm trying to talk about a huge group of stories that share common origins and some important overlapping characteristics. But even though mystery and crime usually get shelved together in the bookstore, they aren't exactly the same genre. A mystery story is more concerned with who did the crime, a whodunit. A crime story is more concerned with the psychology of the criminal and why they committed the crime, a whydunit. A mystery story is a puzzle. A crime story is a psychological study. A detective story is even a little bit more precise. It requires, shockingly, a detective, either a professional or an amateur. Many mystery stories, maybe even the majority of mystery stories, are detective stories, but a detective isn't technically required to make a mystery a mystery. We'll be talking about crime and mystery and detective writing today. There are some very early ancestors of the modern crime and mystery story. Some scholars have pointed to the 5th century BCE Greek playwright Sophocles In Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, Oedipus investigates the murder of King Laius. Spoiler, Oedipus did it. Oops. There were apparently Chinese crime puppet shows during the Song dynasty, the 10th through 13th centuries CE, although no examples of these puppet shows survive. There are still surviving copies of a play about the Song-era magistrate Judge Bao, written by the 14th century playwright Li Qianfu. By the way, I've been told by my spouse, who has a degree in classical Chinese, that Judge Bao has been incorrectly called the Chinese Sherlock Holmes. This is obviously anachronistic. There were 19th century Chinese readers who almost immediately recognized that Holmes was indeed the Western Judge Bao. And we will be talking about Sherlock Holmes in just a minute. But Rosemary Herbert, Harvard librarian and the editor of the Oxford Companion to Mystery and Crime Writing, points out that fiction about crimes requires societies that are concerned about crime. That's why, in many ways, modern crime and mystery fiction is a product of the Industrial Revolution. Many people moved away from small villages and towns where they knew everyone. They were looking for work in larger cities where there were jobs at the rapidly growing number of factories. Now, when you put lots of strangers in the same place, especially strangers with little or no sense of community, strangers who aren't in great financial straits, you create impersonal problems that are a lot more complex than the interpersonal problems in small villages and towns, and the problems are often a lot more complicated to solve. In other words, you've invented modern crime. And I suppose even when there's no actual crime, urban life among strangers involves a lot of suspicion between the people who are suddenly thrown into close proximity with one another. You've created the perfect environment for crime stories. There are a few candidates for the father of the modern mystery, but American writer Edgar Allan Poe and his 1841 story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, usually get the credit. The Murders in the Rue Morgue is about an impossible crime committed in a sealed room, what came eventually to be known as a locked room mystery. And there's an eccentric and brilliant investigator on the case. Murders in the Rue Morgue introduced the eccentric, brilliant investigator C. Auguste Dupin. He's an amateur sleuth from a noble family who has fallen on difficult times. He reappears in The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. It is difficult to overstate the influence of Edgar Allan Poe on the crime and mystery genre, especially in Japan, as we'll discuss in just a few minutes. But despite the eventual importance of Edgar Allan Poe's mystery, there was no great rush to imitate his work. 19th century crime and mystery fiction diverged in many different directions, virtually none of them immediately following Poe's model. When the next great mystery writer did appear, it was to debut, perhaps, the most famous detective of them all. In 1887, not yet Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published A Study in Scarlet in Beaton's Christmas Annual. The story introduced not only Sherlock Holmes, but also his assistant, Dr. John H. Watson, to the world. Between 1887 and 1927, Holmes appeared in 4 novels, including A Study in Scarlet, and 56 short stories, all set between 1880 and 1914. It was really under Doyle's pen that crime and mystery writing came into its own. In the words of Rosemary Herbert, while Poe sketched the pattern and conventions of the genre, Arthur Conan Doyle gave the genre its human interest. For what it's worth, Doyle knew he was following in Poe's footsteps. He once described Poe's stories as a model for all time. Doyle also created a convenient narrative formula. A client presents a problem, the detective, and possibly his sidekick, certainly in Doyle's formula, his sidekick, investigate, and the reader learns the solution, often because the detective explains it to the other characters. The formula keeps the focus on the intellectual puzzle. The reader doesn't have to think about law and order, punishment, good and evil. The period after Holmes' stories are set and between the world wars, the 1920s and 1930s, has been described as the golden age of detective fiction. Many works of golden age detective fiction follow rules set down by Ronald Knox, a Catholic priest who wrote detective novels on the side. Knox maintained that detective novels were a kind of intellectual exercise. You can find a link to Knox's very influential 10 Commandments for Detective Fiction on the episode page. Don't worry, they're not religious. They're actually very important principles for how Golden Age detective fiction stories work. Agatha Christie is the author of the Golden Age of detective fiction. During her career, she wrote 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections. The Guinness Book of World Records currently lists Christie as the best-selling author of all time, with more than 2 billion copies sold. She created several important detectives, but the best loved are almost certainly Hercule Poirot and Miss Jane Marple. Poirot is heavily influenced by Sherlock Holmes, and also C. Auguste Dupin. Miss Marple is an elderly spinster based loosely on friends, or in Christie's words, cronies, of Christie's step-grandmother. Christie is also a hugely influential author in Japan. A 2012 survey ranked her, And Then There Were None, as the #1 non-Japanese detective novel. Like the work of Edgar Allan Poe, the work of Golden Age detective novelists has been important for Japanese crime and mystery writing. It was important on contemporary Japanese writers, and it has been important on more recent Japanese writers beginning in the 1980s who were part of the New Orthodox school of mystery writing, as we'll discuss in the next section of the episode. The Golden Age of detective fiction also saw the birth of the hard-boiled story. It began as a notably American genre, and its early influences included the evolution of organized crime in the era of Prohibition. Prohibition was the period during which the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol was almost entirely illegal in the U.S. from 1920 to 1933. It's not just organized crime that's a problem in hard-boiled detective fiction. Hard-boiled novels reflect all kinds of threats that prevent individuals from achieving the American dream: shady businesses, crooked cops, corrupt politicians. Hard-boiled stories still belong under the big tent of crime and mystery, but they differ from the work of, say, Agatha Christie in several ways. For one, the detectives often have become jaded by violence. They tend to be cynical, maybe even anti-heroes. And the central figures often aren't working for the police or as amateur detectives. They're often private eyes, professionals working for themselves. Carol John Daly pioneered the hard-boiled story in the mid-1920s, especially with his PI Race Williams, who took on the racist terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, in his very first appearance, 1929's Knights of the Open Palm. Books like Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon and Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep are classic hard-boiled novels. Raymond Chandler, in particular, gets mentioned often by Japanese authors. He's a special favorite of a non-mystery writing Japanese author. Haruki Murakami loves Chandler's work and has translated a great deal of it into Japanese. Crime writing, as opposed to mystery writing, really came into its own after World War II. Given the massive social upheaval in the decades after the war, it's really no surprise writers grew more interested in the personalities and social conditions that drove someone to a life of crime than they were in clues and detection. Especially after World War II, crime and mystery writing grew to be a bigger and bigger umbrella, covering an ever-growing number of other genres or subgenres. Crime and mystery storytelling is also compatible with a lot of other genres. My mother's favorite are crime and mystery romances, and I've read a few of those myself. If you are a long-time listener, or you've gone back to the beginning of Read Japanese Literature's episodes, you might remember Iharu Saikaku from our episode on high and low literature in Edo, Japan. In that episode, we talked about Saikaku's The Life of an Amorous Man and the protagonist's packing list for a trip to the legendary Island of Women. Anyway, Iharu Saikaku is the author credited with one of the earliest crime and mystery stories in the history of Japanese literature. He followed older Chinese models of stories about wise judges to write his own Tales of Japanese Justice in 1689. Saikaku's wise judge was based on the historical Edo City Commissioner Uuka Tadasuke. And Tales of Japanese Justice, by the way, is available in English translation by Thomas M. Kondo and Alfred H. Marks. Ueda Akinari's 18th century Tales of Moonlight and Rain also shaped the way generations of Japanese writers called on elements of horror, suspense, and twist endings. While they aren't crime stories, they've also been called an important forebear of Japanese mysteries. And Read Japanese Literature also covered Tales of Moonlight and Rain in a Season 1 episode about kaidan. In the 19th century, kabuki plays and then newspaper articles satisfied a public demand for stories about law and justice. As a matter of fact, kabuki remained an important medium for detective stories through the 1930s, although we're not really going to discuss that today. But the story of Japanese crime and mystery writing really begins with the influx of English and French language crime and mystery writing in the 1880s and 1890s. Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue appeared in a condensed Japanese translation in 1887, and Sherlock Holmes debuted in Japan in 1899. A man named Shuroku Kuriawa played an under-celebrated role in increasing the Japanese audience for mystery stories. His newspaper, Yorozu Choho, or Morning Variety, was the most widely circulated Tokyo daily paper by 1902. He published more than 60 translations and adaptations of American, English, and French writers, pioneers of the detective genre, not only like Poe and Doyle, but also Anna Catherine Green, Wilkie Collins, and Emile Gaboriau. Kuriawa also wrote his own stories under the pen name Ruriko Kuriawa. 1899's In Cold Blood is probably the oldest example of a detective story using the traditional detective story structure written in Japanese. Despite Kuriawa's influence, it is Edogawa Rampo who is widely considered the father of the Japanese mystery story. Edogawa Rampo is, unsurprisingly, a pen name. The author's real name was Taro Hirai. In case you haven't quite made the connection yet, he took his pen name from the Japanese pronunciation of the American author Edgar Allan Poe. And just a quick note that Read Japanese Literature normally uses English language name order for authors. It makes it easier to track books down at English language bookstores and libraries. Edogawa Rampo is a common exemption. You just ruin his pen name if you switch things up. Edogawa is the surname. In 1923, Edogawa published the story The 2-sen Copper Coin in what was then Japan's only mystery magazine. Before Edogawa, the magazine had been filled with translations of foreign stories. In part, the 2-sen copper coin is a reinterpretation of Edgar Allan Poe's 1843 story, The Gold Bug. The narrator's roommate tries to track down the location of money stolen by 2 bored and impoverished university students. Ogawa's version has a fun and unexpected twist. You can read the story in English translation by Jeffrey Angles in Modernism, Modernist Fiction from Japan, 1913 to 1938. That book also has the translation of The Town of Cats that we used in our episode about cats in Japanese literature. Edogawa's The Beast in the Shadows is often considered his mystery masterpiece. It has been translated in a double volume along with The Black Lizard by Ian Hughes. Edogawa has a famous detective of his own by the name of Kogoro Akechi, who appears in The Black Lizard. It's worth noting that some of Japan's most highly regarded authors from the first half of the 20th century also experimented with crime and mystery writing. Ryunosuke Akutagawa's In a Bamboo Grove is something of a crime and mystery story. Even though Akutagawa has a story called Rashomon, the 1950 Akira Kurosawa film much more closely resembles In a Bamboo Grove. In the story, several people tell subjective and sometimes contradictory versions of the murder of a samurai. Junichiro Tanazaki's Tojo is a tongue-in-cheek story about a man's scheme to kill his wife. I can't find any evidence that that one has been translated. I'd be very happy to be corrected. But 2 of Tanazaki's mysteries have been translated in volumes that are easily accessible to non-academics: Devils in Daylight, translated by J. Keith Vincent, and In Black and White, translated by Phyllis I. Lyons. Scholars sometimes break the history of Japanese mystery novels, a history that, again, really begins with Edogawa, into 3 periods or eras: the Tantei, or puzzle-solving era, the Shakai-ha, or social school era, and the Shin Honkaku-ha, or New Orthodox era. I'm going to take the next few minutes to describe each era and name an author or 2 that belongs to each. The Tantei era of Japanese mysteries really began with Edgar Allan Poe and lasted until the late 1950s. The emphasis of the Tantei era was on the qualities that distinguished English language Golden Age mysteries. The emblematic Tantei mystery was a puzzle: ingenuity, deduction, maybe an eccentric detective thrown into the mix. Eventually, the magazines that published mysteries in the 1920s and 30s began to differentiate honkaku mysteries from henkaku mysteries. Honkaku means orthodox. Honkaku mysteries are standard mysteries that contain only more or less plausible events. Henkaku mysteries were different or innovative or strange. Henkaku mysteries sometimes look like they belong to genres modern English language readers often don't think about as mysteries at all. They incorporate the macabre, the psychotic, the erotic. Much of Japan's earliest sci-fi was categorized as henkaku mystery and published in mystery magazines. Few readers really separated SF from mystery until well after World War II. In fact, the first issue of Japan's SF magazine didn't debut until 1960. Eventually, Edgar Allan Poe wrote mostly henkaku mysteries. In fact, most of the Edogawa work available in English is henkaku. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of work from the Tantei era available in English translation. Kabuki playwright Kido Okamoto published serialized stories about Inspector Hanshichi until 1937. These stories are available in Ian M. MacDonald's translation of the Curious Casebook of Inspector Hanshichi, Detective Stories of Old Edo. Keiichi Osaka was another honkaku writer whose stories have been collected and translated by Ho-Lee Wong as The Ginza Ghost and Other Stories. And our focus author for today, Seishi Yokomizo, was probably the last great honkaku mystery writer. His Detective Kosume Kindaichi stories debuted in 1948. Pushkin Vertigo has been releasing them in translation at the rate of about one per year since 2019. Translators so far include not only Louise Heal Kawai, but also Brian Karetenik, Jim Rion, and Yumiko Yamazaki. Crime and mystery stories were censored by Japanese authorities during the Pacific War. In 1939, Edgar Allan Poe was ordered to remove his published work from sale because it was injurious to public morals. Many other writers of many genres simply obeyed in advance. A massive paper shortage in the 1940s meant there was very little fiction of any kind being published anyway. After the war, Edgar Allan Poe and others began to engineer the Tante novel's comeback. Edgar Allan Poe helped to found what eventually became the Japanese Mystery Writers Club in 1947. In 1948, the association began giving the Mystery Writers of Japan Award for the best crime fiction published in the previous year. In 1955, Kodansha Publishers and Fuji Television sponsored the creation of the Edgar Allan Poe Prize for new mystery writers in his honor. For people who are already fans of Japanese mystery novels, I should note that both Natsuo Kirino and Keigo Higashino are previous winners. If you're interested in Japanese mystery awards, check out the list of Japanese crime and mystery writing on the Read Japanese Literature website. It notes who won which awards and whether their award-winning work is translated into English. Eventually, the generic boundary between detective fiction and other literary genres blurred, and the appeal of the detective story as extraordinary mysteries and entertaining puzzles waned. The 1960s saw the rise of shakai-ha, or the social school of detective fiction in Japan. And these newly popular stories emphasized social realism. Shakai-ha mysteries tend to be more literary and realistic. Authors are supposed to pay more attention to credible motivations and the way people's lives actually look. They're a little bit more like English language hard-boiled novels, too. The crimes are often more about systems than individuals. Political crimes, corrupt people in power, organized crime. Seicho Matsumoto was perhaps the dominant influence on social school mysteries. Matsumoto is by far the most widely translated social school mystery author, with works like Inspector Imanishi Investigates, translated by Beth Carey, and Point Zero, translated by Louise Heal Kawai. You can also find the work of many social school writers in Ellery Queen's Japanese mystery stories, selected and edited by Ellery Queen. Ellery Queen, by the way, is a two-person pen name for Manfred Lee and Frederick Dene, who wrote Golden Age detective fiction novels together. Ellery Queen novels are also highly popular in Japan. In the words of Saito Satoru at Rutgers University, the realistic approach of the social school led to the loosening of the rules of the detective story. And it wasn't long before that led to pushback. People missed some of the features of more traditional or orthodox detective stories. Even preeminent social mystery authors called for a return to some of the classic elements of Golden Age detective novels. For example, Seicho Matsumoto edited a 10-volume collection from 1966 to 1967 that included novels that were supposed to incorporate both new social school ideals and elements of older mysteries. One of the authors to appear in this collection was Masuko Togawa. Ali Pai, one of the members of the Goodreads Japanese literature group I'm in, recently introduced me to Togawa, so I'm glad I get to talk about her a little bit today. Togawa was not just a mystery writer. When she was 23, she started a career as a nightclub singer. I've put a recording of Togawa singing up on the episode page. It's not a great recording, but I love her smoky alto. In 1961, Togawa started writing backstage. She published The Master Key in 1962 and won the Edgar Allan Poe Prize for her very first novel. She went on to write more than 30 novels and became one of the most popular mystery writers in Japan. 4 of her novels are available in English. The Master Key was translated by Simon Grove. In 1967, Togawa turned her sister's coffee shop into a nightclub, the Blue Room, and it became an important gathering place for lesbians. Togawa was an out lesbian herself. From 1969 to 1974, she even played a character based on her own life in a show called Playgirl. It's about a writer who creates an all-women detective agency to investigate white-collar crime. The call for a return to the elements of Golden Age mysteries also set off a Seishi Yokomizo revival. Publishers put out a manga edition of his The Village of Eight Graves in 1968, and they also produced a pocketbook edition of his stories in 1971. By 1979, the series had sold more than 40 million copies. The 1980s and 1990s were the era of Shin Honkaku-ha, the New Orthodox School. The New Orthodox School asked for a return to the classic whodunit style of mystery novel. Yukito Ayatsuji, Tetsuya Ayukawa, Hiroko Minagawa, Natsuhiko Kyugoku, and Hiroko Minagawa founded the Honkaku Mystery Club in the year 2000. All except Minagawa have standalone books translated into English, and since 2001, the Honkaku Mystery Club has awarded a prize to the best orthodox Japanese mystery newly published in the last year. Yukito Ayatsuji is probably the author most associated with the New Orthodox movement. His House Murders series is currently being translated, so far entirely by Ho-Ling Wong. It begins with The Decagon House Murders. Rosemary Herbert and Yale professor Mark Silver describe The Decagon House Murders as a manifesto for the movement to revitalize the classic mystery novel in Japan. In an opening chapter, one character exclaims, "Enough gritty realism, please. What mystery novels need are a great detective, a mansion, a shady cast of residents, bloody murders, impossible crimes, and never-before-seen tricks played by the murderer." Incidentally, not all of Ayatsuji's work is New Orthodox mystery. He also wrote the supernatural mystery horror Another series, translated by Karen McGillicuddy and Nicole Wilder. Other New Orthodox authors include Soji Shimada. 2 of his Kiyoshi Mitarai novels are available in English, including the Tokyo Zodiac Murders, translated by Ross and Shika Mackenzie. Shimada even wrote a manifesto on the subject of New Orthodox mysteries in 1989. It seems like New Orthodox mysteries hit peak popularity around the turn of the millennium. According to the editor-in-chief of the publishing imprint Asahi Bunko, the crime and murder mystery genre today, around the year 2024, is all about police procedurals. Japanese crime and mystery also has its own subgenres or niches. I'm going to outline one that isn't necessarily unique to Japan, but that has evolved in its own way in Japan. Women have been involved in mystery writing beginning almost as soon as English-language mysteries arrived in Japan. Some pre-war Japanese feminists translated English-language mysteries into Japanese or wrote mysteries of their own. Some women's magazines even featured true-life accounts of women detectives. Women continued to write mysteries in Japan through the social school and New Orthodox eras. For example, we already discussed Masako Togawa. In the 1970s and 80s, Natsuki Shizuoka and Misa Yamamura were major women's voices. They've both been translated into English. But something new began to happen in the 1990s, a sort of combination of the social school and Orthodox mystery traditions that also incorporated what Professor Amanda Seaman calls a new sensibility about women's roles within contemporary society that became almost its own genre, and it was led by women. Miyuki Miyabe is one of the most influential women mystery writers of her generation, and really the first major voice in this new genre or subgenre. Her second novel, translated into English by Alfred Birnbaum as All She Was Worth, represented a watershed in the history of Japanese women's detective fiction, and also started a movement of women mystery writers in the 1990s and beyond that dwarfed women's previous involvement in the genre. Along with Miyabe, Kaoru Takamura also received a great deal of media attention for her role in kicking off this new women's mystery writing boom. Takamura's two-part Lady Joker is now available in English translation by Marie Iida and Alison Markin Powell. Writers like Asa Nonami really developed the genre by introducing women as detective protagonists and exploring the desires and concerns of modern Japanese women. Her Takako Otamichi, who stars in The Hunter, is, from the back of the book, a former motorbike patrolwoman turned detective who was partnered with an older, seasoned misogynist detective in a murder investigation of a dating club that introduces adult men to high school girls. That one has been translated into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter. Other writers important to this women's mystery writing boom include Yoshiki Shibata, whom I believe is untranslated, and Natsuo Kirino, beloved in English translation for Out, Grotesque, and Real World. It's worth noting that the Japanese women's mystery writing boom isn't divorced from what was happening in the English mystery writing world. West of Japan, the 1980s were the heyday of Marcia Mueller, Sarah Paretsky, Lisa Cody, and Sue Grafton, and their independent female PIs. Japanese publishers promised that translations of these authors would have 4 Fs: female protagonist, female author, female translator for a female reader. One interesting offshoot of these mysteries by women is the rise of the iyamisu, or ew mystery, as in mysteries that make their readers go, ew. There's been a special iyamisu boom since the early 2010s, although you could easily classify the work of writers like Asa Nonami and Natsuo Kirino as iyamisu. Writers more notably associated with the iyamisu genre include Kanae Minato, author of Confessions and Penance, and Mahokaru Numata, author of Noncore. Seishi Yokomizo was born in Kobe, Japan in 1902. He was a pharmacist by training, but decided he would rather write. He published his first story in 1921. He had grown up reading detective fiction, and Edgar Allan Poe encouraged him to move to Tokyo to pursue a writing career. Yokomizo was also a sickly man. By 1934, he was suffering from tuberculosis. During the Pacific War, virtually no one in Japan could get access to adequate medical care for tuberculosis. He apparently joked with his friends that he wasn't sure whether he was more likely to die from untreated tuberculosis or starvation. When the Pacific War ended, Yokomizo was instrumental in revitalizing the crime and mystery writing genre. In a 1946 essay called Detective Fiction and the War, Yokomizo made a pretty profound claim that, quote, "The Japanese find themselves in this atrocious predicament because they do not read enough detective fiction." In Yokomizo's view, pre-war Japanese society would have benefited from the logic and problem-solving abilities necessary for solving fictional murder mysteries. In 1948, Yokomizo won the very first Mystery Writers of Japan Award for the Honjin Murders. Unfortunately, and as we discussed a few minutes ago, Yokomizo's style of orthodox mysteries fell out of fashion not long after he began writing. Nevertheless, his works were rediscovered in the late 1970s at the beginning of the New Orthodox school boom. By the time Yokomizo died of colon cancer in 1981, he had sold more than 55 million books. In the first part of the episode, I mentioned a 2012 survey that ranked Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None the most popular non-Japanese mystery in Japan. The same survey ranked Yokomizo's Death on Gokumon Island as the #1 best Japanese mystery. Yokomizo actually appears twice in the top 10 mysteries on that survey. The Honjin Murder is number 10. The Honjin Murders is a frame narrative. It opens with a fictional author speaking directly to his reader, explaining how he came to learn about the fictional Honjin Murders case. Let me mention about this narrator that translator Louise Heal Kawai speaks on the podcast In Gad We Trust about thinking about this narrator as an important character. He apparently narrates many of Yokomizo's books. He always presents himself as a writer of Japanese mystery novels, but he's not Yokomizo. He's not even a fictionalized version of Yokomizo. He's just a writer of mystery novels whom Yokomizo presents as his narrator. In that podcast, Kawai talks about using Sherlock Holmes' English language voice to recreate the way that this narrator sounds in Japanese. The Honjin Murders is the only Yokomizo novel translated by Kawai, so I'm sure that the narrator sounds different under the pen of different translators. The novel opens with this narrator, this fictional author, speaking directly to the reader, explaining how he came to learn about this fictional Honjin Murders case. Someone in the Read Japanese Literature Facebook group asked if I understood why The Honjin Murders is the only translated Yokomizo novel to take place before World War II. While I don't have a perfect answer about why the action takes place in 1937, I can point out that the novel as a whole actually doesn't take place before World War II. When the novel opens, it's actually after World War II has ended. And the narrator is relaying events that took place the previous spring, presumably spring 1945, when the number of American bombings of Tokyo were at their peak. The unnamed narrator had been evacuated to a small farming village in Okayama Prefecture. The narrator tells us that since he writes detective stories, the people he meets always love to tell him about mysterious happenings. Usually their stories are much more boring and mundane than they think they are, but this is how he came to learn about the Honjin murder case. This frame narrative setup is great for a couple of reasons. One, it keeps the story contemporary while still allowing the events to take place before the war, specifically, as I mentioned, in 1937. And two, the 9-year difference between the frame and the events provides the opportunity for Yokomizo to comment on the ways life in Japan has changed in the last decade, and how much it is continuing to change in the late 1940s. It allows Yokomizo, through his narrator, to make observations like this one, quote, "We are now in a period of upheaval following the Second World War, and farmers and peasants are increasingly no longer obliged to kowtow to the upper classes or to show the same level of respect for those with high social standing, fortune, or property. These values have come crashing down in the wake of Japan's defeat." That particular comment is not only timely, but also relevant for the Honjin Murders. Most of the characters are members of one of two families, an old family of good reputation and a well-educated family with new money and no background. The Ichiyanagi family lives in what was once an important inn for government officials during the Edo period. They are wealthy and respected as a family of lineage. The Kubos are wealthy, but from a long line of tenant farmers. These two families are about to become associated through marriage. Kenzo Ichiyanagi is betrothed to Katsuko Kubo. Kenzo is the groom, Katsuko is the bride. But both of their families are wary of this match, especially the Ichiyanagi. Quote, no matter how educated Katsuko is, or how large a fortune she possesses, the daughter of a tenant farmer will always be just that, the daughter of a tenant farmer. On Kenzo and Katsuko's wedding night, the residents of the Honjin and their guests wake up to the sounds of screams. They rush into the room where Kenzo and Katsuko were celebrating their marriage to find Kenzo and Katsuko brutally murdered, and no one can figure out how. It was a locked room. This is a locked room mystery. The book even includes a sketch to help readers understand the convoluted setup of the room in which the bodies were found. Katsuko's uncle Ginzo calls in his protege, Kosuke Kindaichi, to investigate. Kosuke Kindaichi is Yokomizo's most famous creation, and for me at least, really the best feature of this book. Kindaichi actually appears in 77 Yokomizo novels. When he shows up for the first time here in the Honjin Murders, he's badly dressed in wrinkled, unmatched clothes with notebooks crammed into his jacket pockets. Kindaichi is quite a character. He's alarmingly enthusiastic, and when he really gets going, he stutters. We also get some backstory for Kindaichi. He did well in his Japanese high school. He was so bored by a university in Tokyo that he dropped out and went to the United States. Kindaichi also got bored in the US and got addicted to narcotics. He accidentally solved a notorious San Francisco murder mystery, and that's when he met the bride's uncle, Ginzo Kubo, who happened to be visiting the US. Don't you think it's about time to stop messing around with those drugs, Ginzo asks. I've been thinking that exact thing. It turns out drugs aren't all they're cracked up to be, Kindaichi replies. Ginzo Kubo agrees to pay for Kindaichi's tuition to finish school in the US. 3 years later, Kosuke tracks Ginzo down and tells him that he wants to become a professional detective. After Kosuke solves his first prominent murder case, Ginzo reads Kosuke's statement in the newspaper. He tells the newspaper, the police investigate footprints and look for fingerprints. I take the results of those investigations, and by piecing together all the available information logically, I am able to reach a conclusion. These are my methods of deduction. I chose to talk about the Honjin Murders today not just because it's important, and not just because it is one of the most popular Japanese mystery novels ever written, and not just because it came recommended by a Patreon supporter, but also because it is a mystery novel about mystery novels and about the history of mystery novels in Japan, at least up to the 1940s. The unnamed narrator has a lot to say about mystery novels in general. He explains to the reader that the Honjin Murders are a locked room mystery in which, quote, the murder takes place in a room with no apparent way for the killer to enter or exit. And then he goes on to list some of the best locked-roomed mystery writers and best locked-roomed mystery stories. I've provided a list of all the stories he mentions in the novel on the episode page, and it's a long list. Kosuke Kindaichi and another character share the narrator's interest in mystery novels, and the mystery novels themselves come up again in the plot, although that's all I can say without risking spoilers. Unfortunately, that's about all I can say, period, about the Honjin Murders. Again, I'm really wary of spoilers today. I will add that at the end of the book, the unnamed narrator turns his attention back to the present. The reader also finds out how deeply the Pacific War affected the Ichiyanagi family, how much the war changed things for this family in a position of traditional local power. One character was drafted to fight in China. Another was in Hiroshima on August 5th, 1945. You might remember from the last episode that there weren't a lot of mentions of Hiroshima in Japanese literature in the late 1940s. A third member of the Ichiyanagi family evacuated Shanghai with, quote, nothing but the clothes on their back. So ultimately, Yokomizo manages to use a brief novel to tell us a 5-decade history of mystery stories in Japan, some of the most interesting sociological aspects of a decade of Japanese history, and one of Japanese readers' favorite mystery stories. So why should we read Japanese crime and mystery fiction? First of all, any reader of crime and mystery fiction in English will find more than 100 new titles to enjoy if they turn their attention to mystery stories translated from Japanese. They'll find new settings, new characters, new tropes, as well as some of their favorite things about crime and mystery writing. On the Read Japanese Literature website, you can find a list I spent days compiling of virtually all Japanese crime and mystery stories that have been translated into English. It's also linked from the episode page. Second of all, we should read Japanese crime and mystery fiction because crime and mystery writing is a hugely popular genre in Japan. Even if, like me, crime and mystery writing isn't your first genre of choice, anyone who wants to explore all that Japanese fiction has to offer will need to pick up a few volumes of Japanese crime and mystery writing. Our focus text today, The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomizo, translated by Louise Heal Kawai, is a great place to start. I hope North Americans remember that they can buy their books from our bookshop.org shop to support the podcast. The best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Starting in November, Apple will be charging an excessive fee to sign up through the Patreon app. Please make sure you sign up through the website or on your Android phone. But anyone who does sign up for Patreon will be getting early access and bonus content with every episode, as well as a weekly newsletter that includes updates about the podcast, any reviews I publish, and updates on all new titles translated from Japanese. Join the folks who keep Read Japanese Literature running and ad-free at patreon.com/Read Japanese Literature. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. We're now on Facebook. Search for Read Japanese Literature or follow the link on the website contact page. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon. We're on YouTube /@Read Japanese Literature, Blue Sky @readjapaneselit.bsky.social, Instagram also @ReadJapaneseLit. Thank you to the translators on Blue Sky who helped me figure some things out about Lonely Castle in the Mirror. Thank you to friends on Goodreads who made some interesting suggestions about Japanese mystery novels. Thank you, of course, to Patreon supporters, especially Jim J, who recommended the Honjin Murders. And thank you, as always, to producer Kaim for today's music, kaimmusic.com.